Hi everyone, welcome to our third lecture on Hippocrates and Hippocratic medicine. I'll start today with just a little bit of background on who the Hippocratics were. In terms of Hippocrates himself, we actually know almost nothing about his biography. We know that he lived from around 460 to 370 BCE, and we know that he was a doctor from the island of Kos in the Aegean Sea. That's about it, actually. We also know that he had students or followers who developed the Hippocratic School of Medicine during and after his lifetime. The Hippocratic Corpus is the name we give to the collection of texts written by Hippocratic doctors. It consists of about 60 texts. Here's a list of the text. You can see that it covers, or that they cover, a wide range of topics. So there's some that are anatomical treatises on particular parts of the body. There's gynecological treatises that some of which we'll get to later in the semester. Some of these are how-to guides for doctors for performing surgeries. Some of them are sort of like recipe books for concocting various kinds of medicines and remedies. So there's a wide range of different types of treatises. Now, the interesting thing about them, or one interesting thing, is that not a single text can actually be definitively attributed to Hippocrates himself. In fact, we know that many of them weren't or couldn't have been written by Hippocrates for various reasons, including the fact that many of them were written after his death. So they were written by a variety of Hippocratic doctors who were followers of Hippocrates and followers of the Hippocratic School of Medicine in later decades and later centuries. Most of them were written from around 450 to 350 BCE. So this was the period where Hippocratic medicine was sort of taking hold. This was during and immediately after Hippocrates' own lifetime. So a lot of the main and central Hippocratic texts were written during this period, although some texts, not ones we'll be focusing on, but some texts were written centuries after this even. Because the texts were written over so much time and by so many different authors, we do find some diversity of views in the corpus. So it's not the case that it's all like a perfectly consistent system of thought. There are inconsistencies sometimes from text to text, different approaches, different ways of thinking about things. Nonetheless, there are definitely some prominent trends of thought and some cohesiveness that holds them together by and large. Okay, so today what I'm going to do is just sort of go through some introductory material on the Hippocratic School of Medicine, but we're actually going to spend the next several weeks on them. We'll end up spending about half of the semester on the Hippocratics, far more than any other thinker or school of thought that we're going to be looking at. And there are a few reasons for that. So one is just the fact that we have by far the most text and material to work with than in the case of any other medical thinker in the ancient world. So that long list of text is evidence of that. We have many, many volumes of Hippocratic writings. That partly reflects a second point, which is the Hippocratic School of Medicine was by far the dominant school of medicine in the ancient world. So if we're trying to understand ancient Greek ideas about medicine, this is the main sort of school of thought that we need to understand. And the third reason is that Hippocrates and the Hippocratic School of Medicine had this really enduring impact on the history of Western thought and on Western medicine. So although Hippocrates himself lived 400 or 500 years BCE, his ideas in the Hippocratic School of Medicine was the dominant or a dominant approach to medicine for over 2,000 years in Western history. So as late as the 1700s and even into the 1800s, you still find medical treatises written by physicians where they appeal to Hippocrates as an authority on medical issues and are still employing Hippocratic medical techniques and ideas. So here's just one example. Hippocrates, the great master of our art, says among the general and particular causes of dysenteries that after an unusually dry winter with northerly winds, if a rainy spring succeed, so on and so on. So the point here is that this text was written in 1795, and this is just one example of many in this medical treatise where the author is just casually appealing to Hippocrates as a reliable source of medical information. Here's a couple other examples, text from the 1700s and one from the 1830s that similarly appeal to Hippocrates as a medical authority. So I think that this is a really sort of fascinating thing to think about that amplifies what's interesting about what we're going to be studying over the next few weeks. I think the Hippocratic School of Medicine is really fascinating in its own right and has a lot of interesting components to it. But I think all of that becomes even more interesting if we think about the fact that this guy Hippocrates, who lived 2600 years ago, had introduced the world to ways of thinking that had a lasting impact for 2,300 years. If my grandfather's grandfather had gone to a doctor, he might very well have been treated using some of the principles of Hippocratic medicine. And that's just a really sort of interesting and wild thing to think about in sort of like the history of Western ideas. Okay, so our main text for today is On Ancient Medicine. This was one of the earliest and most influential Hippocratic treatises. It was written in the late 5th century, and in it the author defends and defines what the art of medicine is and attempts to distinguish it from other kinds of medical practices and other kinds of inquiry. The author defends 5 main claims, and this is how I'll organize today's PowerPoint. The first is that medicine is an art. The second is that medicine proceeds empirically. The third is that ancient dietetics was a primitive form of medicine. The fourth is that medical knowledge is imperfect. And fifth, philosophical theories are irrelevant to medicine. So let's start with the very first claim here. Medicine is a genuine art. So the word for art here is the Greek term techne, and it doesn't so much refer to art in our modern sense of sort of like a creative product or the act of creative production. An art is a technical skill. That's where we get the word technical. It's a technical skill or branch of knowledge. What distinguishes a techne for the Greeks is that it's the sort of thing that involves a body of knowledge, a body of principles, of information, and of special techniques, and it's the sort of body of information that needs to be taught and learned. So to give a couple of examples, in the ancient world, an example of a techne would have been shoemaking. Shoemaking was considered a technical skill, not something that just anyone could do. And if you wanted to learn the skill of shoemaking, you would need to study with a shoemaker, and they would teach you the techniques, the principles, how to troubleshoot when issues arise, and so on. And once you had learned all of those things, you would then become an expert. Another example would have been the art of navigation. So in order to captain a ship, it was necessary to know all sorts of things. So for one thing, you would need to know some astronomy. You would need to know how to use the stars to guide your ship and navigate. You would also need to know the sort of technical aspects of how to literally steer and direct the ship, how to deal with troublesome circumstances on the seas, how to land or dock a ship, and so on. And this was the sort of thing that you would, if you wanted to learn, you would go and need to be taught it. An example of something that wouldn't count as a techne would be something like walking. So my little nephew just learned to walk this past month, and that's something that he learned, but it's not a technical skill. In other words, we didn't send him to walking school to learn the principles and the knowledge that consist in walking. Rather, he just sort of naturally started pulling himself up on furniture and then taking like one step and falling and then taking a couple more steps. And over time, he figured out how to walk. So walking is the sort of thing that many people or most people do, but it's not the sort of thing that we think of ourselves as being like expert walkers once we learn it. And it's not the sort of thing we go to school to learn, or that there's principles and a body of knowledge around. So medicine, the author of this text is arguing, is a technical skill in the sense of it's something that involves really specialized knowledge, and that there are experts in the field that are distinguished from people who lack that knowledge. So the author argues that, look, some doctors are good doctors and other doctors are bad doctors. And he says that this is especially apparent during difficult or acute cases. So he uses this analogy to, again, navigation. He says, when it comes to pilots, their mistakes are unnoticed as long as they're steering in calm weather, but when a great storm overtakes them with a violent gale, everyone sees clearly then that it is the pilot's ignorance and mistakes that have lost the ship. So the idea here is, if you're just, steering a ship on the open seas in calm waters and there's no problems, it might be that anyone can sort of like take charge and run the ship for a little while. But when you notice that there are experts versus non-experts is when seas get stormy, the ship gets in trouble. And then you actually need somebody who is a professional navigator who has that expertise in order to make sure that things go well with the ship and that it's not lost in the sea, lost at storm, etc. And similarly, the author is claiming medicine is that sort of thing, where it might be that there's lots of minor medical issues that just about anybody could deal with. So like when we get a paper cut, anybody is capable of, bandaging it up with a Band-Aid, and that's fine. But when serious medical issues arise, when we, break a bone, when we have serious illnesses or health problems, that's when it becomes especially clear that not just anybody has the relevant knowledge. And so the fact that doctors vary in how effective they are, and that we can see this most during the really difficult and acute medical issues that arise, this is part of the evidence, the author is arguing, that shows that medicine really does require expertise and knowledge, just like something like navigation. Now, you might wonder, why is the author so concerned with arguing that medicine is a techne? Well, for one thing, they wanted to prove that they were professionals. So now, today, we take it for granted that the medical profession is a field that involves expertise. People go to school and training for many, many years to learn it, and we sort of take it for granted that it's a legitimate profession, a legitimate branch of knowledge or expertise. But the Hippocratics were living at a time where that wasn't taken for granted. This was a relatively new profession. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it was a profession in the sense that it was a career. It was a way of earning a living. And in order to earn a living as a doctor, and in order to get people to, be willing to pay them for their services, they had to prove or convince people that they had a kind of knowledge that not just anybody had. So one reason why they want to argue that it's a techne is because that's what they need to show their audience, their potential clients is true in order to get people to come to them when they have medical problems. Another reason why they want to argue that it's a techne is that they wanted to distinguish themselves from their competitors. There were lots of different people in the ancient world who claimed to be able to help when people had diseases or medical issues come up. And the Hippocratics wanted to set themselves apart from those competitors and say, we are the actual experts, the ones with the actual knowledge that is relevant to treating these issues. In a lot of their works, including on ancient medicine, but also in many other places, they often are critical of people that they consider imposters in the healthcare industry. So we also read excerpts for this week from on the sacred disease. The sacred disease is the name that in the ancient world they gave to what we now call epilepsy. And in that treatise, the Hippocratic author denies that some diseases are divine while others are not. So the idea here is that early Greeks thought that certain diseases had purely supernatural causes. That is, there were no natural explanations that could be given of it. It was purely the result of divine intervention and the supernatural realm. And the Hippocratics want to argue against that. So they say those who attributed a sacred character to this malady were magicians, purifiers, charlatans, and quacks. They were at a loss, and having no treatment which would help, they concealed and sheltered themselves behind superstition and called this illness sacred so that their utter ignorance might not be manifest. So what they're arguing here is that these other other people competing with them in the healthcare industry who claim that something like epilepsy is supernatural are doing so simply because they don't understand it. They don't understand the natural causes behind the illness, and because they don't want to admit their ignorance, they just attribute it to supernatural causes. And what the Hippocratics are doing is denying that. They're denying that some diseases have purely supernatural causes. They want to say, look, we might not understand the natural causes of every disease yet, but that doesn't mean that just because we don't understand it, it must be due to the supernatural. And a related criticism is that they reject the use of magic, purification rituals, and superstition to treat diseases. So, talking about people who practice these kinds of methods, they say if the patient should recover, they earn a reputation for cleverness, that is, the healthcare practitioners. But should he die, they have a sure fund of excuses with the defense that they are not at all to blame, but rather the gods. So what they're saying is, look, people who attribute diseases to supernatural causes use sort of like superstition and magical rituals to try to get rid of it. And then if they're successful, they can claim that, that's because they know how to do the magic that, is able to interact with the supernatural in the right way. If they fail, they always have the excuse that, well, the gods weren't responsive this time. And notice that in this sort of confrontation between the Hippocratics and their competitors, we see like a sort of ancient analog of an issue that still arises with the medical field. There are still lots of people competing in the healthcare industry that practice and try to market pseudoscientific products and practices to cure diseases and promote health. And doctors and scientists still have to sort of confront those practices with evidence and try to convince people not to, waste their money or risk their health on them. Okay, so that's the first claim, that medicine is a genuine techne or art or expertise. The second claim has to do with epistemology. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. If you are a philosophy student or you take more philosophy courses, you'll come to know epistemology as one of the main branches of philosophy as a discipline. And it involves studying things like what knowledge is, how it's acquired, how we learn new things, and also what kinds of things are knowable, whether any things are knowable, and what sorts of things are not knowable. It comes from the Greek word episteme, which just means knowledge. So Hippocratic epistemology is the Hippocratic account of how we learn new things, and in particular, how we learn new things and acquire new knowledge in the field of medicine. And their answer is that medical discovery is a very long, gradual process that takes a lot of time and work. And the ways that it progresses, the way that we learn new things about medicine, is through experiment, trial and error, observation, and testimony. So we listen to patients, we hear what they say, how they're feeling, we try out different things, we observe the effects, we record those effects, we learn from them, we try them again, we try different things if those aren't working. That's the way that medical practice or medical discovery takes place, through empirical methods. And so new research always has to sort of build on what has already been recorded and studied and observed, and build and move forward based on previous discoveries. And the more that we do this kind of research, the more that we will make progress in the field and learn more and more and make new discoveries. Okay, so that's the Hippocratic account of how we learn things, how we gain medical knowledge. The third claim in the treatise involves a history of medicine. So the author wants to sort of talk about how medicine as an art developed, and in the process, he also engages in what we might call speculative anthropology. So a bit of speculation about how earlier humans lived and behaved. And what he wants to argue is that medical methodology, the methodology of sort of trial and error and observation that I just described, was employed by early humans that were seeking to find out what kinds of foods and drinks and ways of life were good for them. So the art of medicine is an extension of earlier efforts to figure out what kind of nutrition and lifestyle is best suited for us as human beings. So the author talks in particular about early dietetics, the process of learning, what kind of diet and nutrition human beings should have. And he starts with the observation that humans don't benefit from the same regimen as other animals. So that much is obvious. What that means is just, the sorts of foods that we eat are not the same sorts of foods that are good for other animals, and the sorts of foods that are good for other animals vary from animal to animal, and many of them are not good for human beings and are actually, could even be poisonous or harmful to us. So the author assumes that there was an early time in human development when humans hadn't learned which foods benefited or harmed them yet compared to other animals. And during that earlier time, they were suffering because they were often eating things that were harmful to them or not the right appropriate things for them to be eating. So, given that they were suffering and experiencing pain and death and eating the wrong things, they were trying to find the nourishment that fit their nature, that was best suited for our human bodies and human nature. And what they did was use research and experiment to discover that. So in other words, they would eat something and notice that it caused them pain, and they would, avoid eating that thing. They would eat another thing and notice that it made them feel nourished and energetic. And this was a gradual process of trial and error, observation, and experiment. So the way that we sort of eat, the regular diet that human beings have today, the author says, were discovered through this process of experimentation over a really, really long amount of time by earlier human beings. And he wants to say that these primitive investigations into diet were an early form of medicine, or a primitive form of medicine, because they employed this same trial and error, experimental, observational, empirical methodology. Now, he acknowledges we don't usually think of it as an art or expertise to know sort of the basic things that human beings should eat, but that's only because everyone has that sort of baseline basic knowledge about diet now. However, the author also wants to argue dietetics is not enough. What earlier humans discovered was just something very basic, which is they determined which kinds of foods generally benefit human beings or generally harm human beings. However, medicine was still needed because what benefits specific people varies from person to person. So some people have food allergies, some people feel sick when they eat certain foods, and that can vary a lot from person to person and circumstance to circumstance. And secondly, what benefits sick people differs from what benefits healthy people. So, medicine is an extension of dietetics. The author says their reasoning was identical and the process of discovery one and the same. Medicine was needed because earlier humans only discovered general rules for what people should eat. So don't eat raw animal carcasses, but cook your meat, for example. But medicine is super complex and involves all of these detailed variations from person to person, circumstance to circumstance, place to place and depending on a person's health condition. And in coming weeks, we'll see more of the details about sort of the role of diet and regimen in Hippocratic thinking. Okay, the fourth main point here concerns the fallibility of Hippocratic science. So medicine, according to the Hippocratic author, is an inexact science. And it's inexact for a few different reasons. Here are two of the main ones. First, the various factors that are relevant to understanding health and disease are incredibly complex and incredibly variable. So there's so many different aspects of human anatomy, human bodies to understand, also to understand how bodies differ from person to person and react differently to different things from person to person. That's all really, really complex and variable. And secondly, medicine necessarily relies on bodily feelings and perceptions as measures of health and disease, but bodily feelings and perceptions are notoriously imprecise and also really difficult to communicate. So it's hard to have an exact science when the science concerns feelings and perceptions, which don't always themselves, feelings and perceptions only give us limited information. Sometimes they give us misinformation. And even when they give us correct information, they can be difficult to communicate exactly to a doctor. I think we've all had the experience of trying to communicate exactly what a certain feeling or problem is in our bodies to a doctor. And it can be really difficult to find the right words to make them understand exactly what it is that we're experiencing so that they can give the best medical advice. So for all of these reasons, or these reasons in particular, medicine is not an exact science. Because the work of medicine is so difficult and complex, the author says, perfectly exact truth is but rarely to be seen in the medical field. But the author wants to resist the idea that medicine is not an art. As we've seen, he is very insistent that it is a technical expertise, and he's anticipating an objection here, which is, medical knowledge is imperfect and inexact, and it makes mistakes sometimes, so it can't possibly be a real expertise. And he says, no, that's not the case. Something can be a technical expertise, but still be imperfect and inexact. And he says that this is evident by the fact that medicine has been able to make progress. Medicine, according to its methodology, is constantly working to build on previous knowledge and make progress toward perfection, progress toward more exactness, but it's a really, really long, difficult process. So he says, yes, it's imperfect, but that doesn't mean it's not a science. It just means that it's a really difficult science that takes a really long time to build up. Okay, so the fifth and final main objective of the author is to criticize earlier philosophical theorists. So earlier philosophers and theorists tended to identify human beings with a specific element or a set of elements. And when it came to understanding health and disease, they tended to attribute all diseases to a single cause, which the Hippocratic author calls a postulate, or a specific set of causes. The Hippocratic author, though, rejects this approach. Okay, so let's just give an example of this kind of approach, some of which we've sort of glimpsed from last week. So we saw that in certain early thinkers, for example, especially Diogenes, human beings are made of hot, dry air, and disease results from problems that happen with the air. So when the air becomes too wet or heavy or dense, that's when, in our bodies that is, that's when disease results. So if that's the case, we're made of hot, dry air, and disease results from problems with the air, and the air not being sort of dry and hot the way that it's supposed to be pure, then the remedy is going to be really simple. Just provide the person with heat and dryness. So this is the sort of approach to medicine that the author is rejecting. Why do they reject this? Well, there's a few reasons to these theoretical approaches that the author has a problem with. So, first of all, if human beings and the world itself are all made of a single thing, like air, it's not clear why diseases should arise in the first place. So, if everything that exists is air, then where is the not air coming from that is going to disturb our bodies if everything is a kind of air? Now, we're only seeing one side of the picture here. I think somebody like Diogenes could have an explanation for this, or a way of responding to this objection, by talking about all the different types of air that there are. But nonetheless, you can still see the basic idea that if there's only one thing, air, then it's not clear where the problems would ever result. The other objection, or another objection, is that if this theoretical approach were correct, then medicine would be really simple. If man were basically made of one substance, he would never feel pain, since there would be nothing to hurt him. So that's the first point, that if we're made of a single thing, it's not clear why diseases would appear in the first place. Moreover, if he should feel pain, the remedy would likewise have to be simple, but in fact there are many remedies because there are many things in the body that engender disease. So they're rejecting the idea that disease can be attributed to a single simple explanation that applies to all cases. Rather, there's lots of different varieties of explanations. Furthermore, foods and other remedies to diseases are themselves really complex. There's no such thing as giving a patient hotness isolated from all other properties. So again, they're responding to somebody who thinks that disease always is caused by coldness of air, for example. And if all disease is caused by coldness, then the remedy would always be simple and the same, namely hotness. But the problem is, it would be futile to order a patient to take something hot, as he would at once ask, which hot thing? And the problem here is that hot things can be astringent or bitter or sweet or moist or dry. Hot things can come in all sorts of varieties with all sorts of complex properties, and all of those various properties or powers have effects on the body that have to be taken into account. So again, the Hippocratic author is objecting to the implied simplicity of what medicine would consist in if disease could all be attributed to a single specific cause. And the author also raises a practical concern, which is that doctors have to be able to communicate effectively with lay people, and lay people don't understand complex theories. So if you want to be an effective physician, you need to be able to make your patients understand what's wrong with them and why and how to act on it. So complex philosophical abstractions are going to be really difficult to do that with effectively. A more general line of critique of theorists is that their theories are neither verifiable nor falsifiable, unlike medical knowledge. So we've seen that a lot of the earlier natural theoreticians and philosophers are concerned with meteorological and astronomical or cosmological phenomena. And the problem is that, at least at this point in history, given the technology available, there's no way to ever verify or falsify any of their claims. If somebody says that the sun is just a hole in the black sky, or if somebody says the sun is a type of fire, or if another person says it's something else, there's no way for them to test these theories at this time. That, the author is claiming, makes it different, makes natural philosophy different from medicine, because medicine does involve testing something. If you think that a certain drug or a certain food will help with an ailment, you can give it to somebody and wait and see if it has the desired effect, and then either verify that it's a good method, or learn that in fact it's not a good method. At least in principle, that should be possible. But in the case of the heavenly bodies and the things in the sky, those aren't the sorts of things that you can test. The author also wants to say that the philosophical approach to the question, what is a human being, isn't necessary to answer in order to know medicine. And so theoretical, abstract, philosophical discussions about human nature and the nature of the universe are irrelevant to doing the sort of on-the-ground stuff that a doctor is actually concerned with. And so the author actually makes the claim that philosophy is completely irrelevant to medicine. The author says, "But my view is that all philosophers or physicians have written on natural philosophy pertains no more to medicine than to painting." So the fifth and final issue that I wanted to focus on from this text is that the author wants to criticize philosophical theory as not relevant to the kind of empirical, observational, trial and error work that doctors, if they're doing their job correctly, the Hippocratics think, engage in. All right, and that is all for today. Thanks, everyone.